They raised their cups. Laughter echoed through the stone hall, and at the center of the banquet, he smiled, the heir to the throne, the Prince of England's torn kingdom. Eustace, son of King Stephen, dressed in silk and fury, raised his goblet in defiance of the war that had consumed his bloodline for nearly 2 decades. One bite, one swallow, one cough. Moments later, the prince was dead. They said it was sudden. They said it was illness. But illness rarely moves with such precision, not in the middle of delicate peace talks. Not when a rival heir stood waiting just across the channel. Not when the death of this one man would silence 20 years of war. Prince Eustace was supposed to inherit everything. He had fought beside his father in the brutal civil war known as the Monarchy, a war ignited by betrayal, fueled by pride, and prolonged by 2 claimants who refused to kneel. He was raised to rule, raised to destroy his father's enemies, raised to crush Henry Plantagenet, the boy from Anjou who dared to claim England as his own. And then, just as Henry began negotiating peace, Eustace collapsed. There was no blood, no screaming, no drawn blades, just a prince who fell silent at a banquet and a kingdom that exhaled, as if the war had been waiting for him to die. Did his heart fail? Did illness strike? Or was it something in the food? Something placed there not by accident, but by design. The chronicles don't accuse, the church doesn't investigate, and King Stephen, the grieving father, never demanded justice. He simply moved on. Within months, he would hand the crown to Henry Plantagenet, the very man his son had sworn to destroy. Some called it fate, others called it mercy, but the whispers never stopped. Because when a prince dies quietly, in a room full of enemies who smile, we don't call it coincidence. We call it a poisoned banquet, and it begins long before the first bite. It begins with a war, with a king, with a boy born from blood and betrayal. He was born with a crown he couldn't wear. Not yet. Not while a brutal civil war shredded the kingdom he was meant to inherit. Prince Eustace entered the world in the shadow of blood. His father, Stephen of Blois, had stolen the English crown from a woman, Empress Matilda, plunging the realm into a nightmarish struggle known as the Monarchy. It was not a war of flags or principles. It was a war of pride, vengeance, and inheritance. And for Eustace, that meant he was not just the king's son. He was a living declaration that the fight would never end. He grew up in fortresses, not gardens. While other boys were taught psalms, Eustace was taught how to kneel before a dying noble and demand their loyalty at swordpoint. He learned the etiquette of diplomacy in French courts, but at home he learned something darker, that everyone, even blood, could be bought or broken. By the time he turned 12, he had already seen the inside of too many war tents and too few cathedrals. And when his father crowned him Count of Boulogne, it wasn't a gift, it was a warning that someday soon he would have to rule a kingdom already soaked in betrayal. He was not a peacemaker, he was bred for conquest. Unlike Henry Plantagenet, the rival claimant raised on patience and strategy, Eustace was born in chaos and taught to answer defiance with fire. He burned lands that refused his father's rule. He raided the holdings of clergy who dared to side with Matilda. The bishops loathed him, the nobles feared him, even the monks in their sanctuaries prayed he would never wear the crown. And yet King Stephen kept forcing the realm to acknowledge his son. Again and again, councils were summoned, oaths demanded. Some barons pledged loyalty out of fear, others refused outright. But Eustace, he never forgot who hesitated. He remembered every name, every sideways glance, every noble who bowed too slowly. He was not content with being heir, he wanted to be king now, while his enemies still breathed. But his enemies were not only across the battlefield. They sat at his father's table, they prayed beside him, they watched him, too angry, too reckless, too hungry for a throne built on compromise. While Stephen began to tire of war, Eustace leaned further into it. He saw peace as surrender and Henry Plantagenet as a plague that must be crushed before it took root. And that's when the talk of peace began. The boy bred for war now faced a world preparing for peace. He was promised the throne, but not the trust. As the years of war dragged on, King Stephen clung more tightly to one thing, making sure that no matter what the bishops or barons whispered, his son Eustace would be crowned after him. Not Henry, not Matilda's cursed bloodline, only Eustace. And so Stephen pushed harder, summoning councils of nobles, pressing his allies, begging for the church's blessing to crown his son king in his own lifetime. But the more he pushed, the more England resisted. The church refused, repeatedly, not out of hatred for Stephen, but out of fear of Eustace. To them, he was no holy anointed monarch in waiting. He was a warhound in noble clothes. Ambitious, impetuous, and already tainted with sin for what he had done to their abbeys and sacred lands. No man of God would lay hands on his head, and without the church's coronation, Eustace's claim remained fragile, no matter how loudly Stephen shouted. Worse still, the lords of England were exhausted. They had bled too long, burned too much, and buried too many sons in the name of Stephen's war. They saw in Eustace a continuation of that agony, not a king, but a fuse. And across the channel, watching every tremor in this dying kingdom, stood Henry Plantagenet. Younger, calculating, descended from the very woman Stephen had robbed, and now wielding not only bloodline, but an army and time. Stephen's throne was beginning to rot from within. Even those once loyal to him began to look sideways at Henry, at compromise, at survival. And Eustace felt it. He wasn't blind. He could see the way his father's hand trembled when speaking of peace. He could hear the hesitations in council chambers. And he knew, with cold certainty, that the war his father had fought for him might be traded away behind his back. He confronted Stephen in private. No scribes recorded the words, but rumor said the castle walls themselves trembled with their shouts. Eustace was not pleading, he was threatening. If Stephen dared to hand the crown to Henry, his own son would burn the realm down with it. And Stephen, once so defiant, so eager for glory, said nothing, because by now the king was tired, so tired, but Eustace wasn't. He still had fire, still had blood in his fists. He left the court soon after, burning with fury. Some said he rode north. Others said he entered a monastery to cool his rage. But wherever he went, the message was clear. If the realm chose peace, then the realm would have to bury its prince. And not long after it did. The prince roared for war, but the kingdom whispered peace. In the summer of 1153, the battlefield moved not with swords, but with silence. Armies still camped in the fields, banners still fluttered, but something had shifted. At Wallingford, two forces stood face to face, King Stephen on one side, Henry Plantagenet on the other, and neither one drew blood. No cavalry charge, no fiery speeches, just talks, murmurs. A quiet understanding that this war had broken England in half, and perhaps it was time to stop, but not for Eustace. He saw treason in every handshake, every envy his father welcomed from Henry's camp felt like a dagger twisted in the back. These weren't peace talks, they were funeral preparations for his legacy. He hadn't fought all these years just to hand the throne to a bastard from Anjou. And yet, that was exactly where the wind was blowing. Stephen's resolve, once iron, now bent like old wood. The barons were tired. The church was unyielding. And Eustace stood alone, screaming into a storm no one else wanted to fight. When Stephen agreed to a temporary truce, it shattered something in his son. Eustace didn't wait. He broke away from the royal camp, furious, disgusted, and betrayed, not just by Henry, not just by the barons, but by his own blood. His own father. He had been bred for fire, and now they expected him to vanish into ashes without even lighting the pyre. He rode not as a prince, but as an exile in his own land. Some say he fled to Cambridge. Others believe he sought refuge in the sacred grounds of Bury St. Edmunds, where monks offered prayers and food in place of power and politics. If it was meant to calm his soul, it failed. He wasn't there for peace. He was hiding, brooding, fuming. A wolf dennied the kill, but the kingdom was already moving on without him. In private, Stephen and Henry continued to negotiate. The terms were not spoken aloud, but the shape of them was clear. Stephen would remain king for life, but after that, the crown would pass to Henry, not Eustace, not the bloodline that had burned England for 20 years. And the moment that idea solidified into action, Eustace fell ill. He was never seen alive in court again. The prince died with a spoon in his hand, not on a battlefield, not in a blaze of glory, not even in defiance, but in silence at a table laid with silver and meat. At Bury St. Edmunds, the war-born heir who had defied armies and cursed kings was found doubled over, gasping, sweating, and choking in front of monks and nobles who said nothing. A sudden illness, they claimed, a fever. Perhaps spoiled food, but those who saw him said it moved too fast, too precise, too convenient. He had arrived only days earlier, bitter and withdrawn. The peace talks had shattered him. He had no crown, no army, no allies. Just a name, and that name now felt like a tombstone. The monastery welcomed him with courtesy, perhaps even pity, but not reverence. They fed him, housed him, gave him a place to rest. And then came the banquet. It wasn't grand. It wasn't royal, just a modest feast in the cloisters, a gesture of hospitality. Fish, bread, wine, herbs. But to Eustace, it was the last supper in a world that had already forgotten him. He ate in silence. Then he coughed. Then he choked. Then he fell. No one ran to summon the king. No one raised the alarm. No suspects were named. No questions asked. And within hours, the heir to England's broken throne was dead. There was no investigation. The monks performed the rites. The body was returned. The court went quiet. Stephen received the news not with rage, not with grief, but with a stillness so strange it left his courtiers whispering behind closed doors. Some said the old king had simply accepted God's will. Others believed the truth was far darker, that Stephen had allowed his own son to be sacrificed to end a war that could no longer be won. But who killed him? And why so suddenly in the very halls of holy men? The answer was never written, not by scribes, not by monks, not even by enemies, but across England, in the fields, in the castles, in the hearts of those who had once feared Prince Eustace. The reaction to his death was not horror. It was relief. No swords were drawn, no vengeance was sworn, only silence. The death of a royal heir should have shattered windows with mourning. Bells should have tolled from every cathedral. Lords should have rushed to pledge new oaths or declare rebellion. But when Prince Eustace died, England exhaled. The court grew still. The barons said nothing. The church offered its prayers not for justice, but for peace. And Stephen, the king who had torn a nation apart for his son's claim, said not a word of blame. Not one servant was questioned, no monk interrogated, no poison tested. The very idea that the prince had been murdered was treated not as fear, but as a relief no one dared admit aloud. Even his burial was quiet. No royal procession, no weeping nobles, just a body lowered into earth and a war that suddenly felt over. To some, it looked like grace, a troubled young man taken by the hand of God before he could bring more ruin. To others, it looked like something colder, a problem removed. And yet the most haunting reaction of all was Stephen's. He did not lash out, he did not accuse, he did not even weep in public. Those closest to him said he seemed lighter, as if a weight had lifted from his chest, as if the fire that had burned behind his eyes for 20 years had finally gone out. It was as if the king had made a choice, and now there was nothing left to fight for. The very day after Eustace's death, Stephen withdrew from Wallingford. He sent envoys to reopen talks with Henry. He no longer demanded recognition for a bloodline. He no longer spoke of inheritance. He spoke only of stability, of peace. But peace built on silence is never clean, and those who stood to gain from that silence were already waiting. The prince was gone, and every door swung open. With Eustace dead, the kingdom shifted like stone under pressure. Old alliances cracked, quiet ambitions rose, and in the void he left behind, the shadows moved fast. For 20 years, the war had hinged on succession, Stephen's son or Matilda's bloodline. Now there was only one path forward, and it led straight to Henry Plantagenet. He had waited, watched. He had seen Stephen grow weary, seen the lords fracture, seen the church recoil at Eustace's rage. But even Henry, with all his cunning, could not have predicted how perfectly the moment would come. No battle, no campaign. Just the sudden vanishing of the rival heir, and like a tide pulling out from shore, the resistance to his claim began to retreat. The church smiled first. They had long despised Eustace for his contempt, for his raids on sacred land, for his threats toward their bishops. With him gone, the bishops found a cleaner conscience in backing Henry, the man raised by Matilda, but shaped in the French courts, molded by patience. A king in waiting who understood diplomacy, not tantrums. And most of all, a king who promised stability. The barons followed, not out of love but fatigue. They had buried sons, burned estates, and bled their coffers dry. The death of Eustace felt to them like the final domino falling. With Stephen softened and no clear successor from his line, there was no longer any cause to resist. What they couldn't win by war, they would now accept by convenience. And yet, beneath all the sighs of relief, the one question no one dared speak aloud still hung in the halls of every castle. Had someone helped fate along? No man was charged, no scandal uncovered. But those who stood to gain, Henry, the church, the neutral lords, gained everything. Eustace's death was the closing of a wound and the unlocking of a throne. There would be no riots, no resistance, only a quiet acceptance that the future now belonged to another man. And that man was already preparing to take his place beside the king who had buried his own son in silence. The crown was never handed down, it was surrendered. In the final months of 1153, with his son buried and his will broken, King Stephen did the unthinkable. He met with Henry Plantagenet face to face, the boy his son had sworn to destroy, the rival he had fought for 2 decades, and called him heir. There was no coronation, no grand ceremony, just a weary king, a rival prince, and a kingdom desperate to stop bleeding. The Treaty of Winchester was signed. Henry would succeed Stephen upon his death. Eustace's name was never spoken. Stephen's decision wasn't just political, it was personal. He had fought for legacy, for dynasty, for the survival of his blood, and in the end, he traded it away for calm. The war that began with a stolen crown now ended with a bowed head, and in that final compromise, Stephen gave England peace, but at the cost of everything he claimed to protect. The barons approved. The church praised him. Even Henry played the role of respectful heir, swearing loyalty to the old king he had once planned to overthrow. But the truth beneath the smiles was colder. Stephen was king in name only. His throne remained upright but hollow. His authority drained. The moment he recognized Henry as successor, the realm began acting like the transition had already happened. Some said it was wise, that Stephen had chosen the realm over revenge. But others, watching the quiet in the halls of Westminster, felt something else. That a father who had outlived his son had also outlived his purpose. He no longer fought for victory, only for the dignity of retreat. No monuments were raised for Eustace, no songs sung. His line was erased not by sword, but by ink, parchment, and silence. And England, so long consumed by fire, now cooled beneath a treaty sealed with loss. But peace is never truly clean, not when built on the bones of a son and the silence of a kingdom. The war ended, but the whispers never did. Even as England quieted, even as Henry Plantagenet prepared to rule and Stephen faded into the background, the name Eustace haunted the kingdom like smoke that refused to clear. There were no official accusations, no trials, no confessions. But in taverns, in cloisters, in corridors where torches burned low, the same question was asked again and again. Was it poison? And if so, who placed it? Some blamed the monks. Easy scapegoats, they had fed him, watched him die, buried him quickly. Others pointed higher, to bishops who saw in Eustace only danger and defiance. There were even whispers, softer still, that the king had known. That Stephen, exhausted and cornered, had let his son be taken in exchange for one final act of control. If he could not defeat Henry, he could at least clear the path. None of it was proven, none of it was denied. And that was the true horror of Eustace's death, not the act, but the silence that followed it. No one asked questions because no one wanted answers. The kingdom needed peace, and peace demanded that certain deaths be accepted without mourning. For those who had feared Eustace, there was relief. But for those who had served him, fought beside him, grown up hearing that he would be king, there was something else. A hollowing, a gnawing grief that never found words. Because he died not in battle, not in exile, not even as a traitor, but as an inconvenience. Forgotten before the ground above him had even settled. In the years that followed, no monument rose in his name, no feast day, no line of succession. He became a footnote in the records of kings, a missing step in the ladder of power, but the rumors lived on that he had been erased. That peace had been bought with blood no blade had spilled. And late at night, in the cold corridors of England's great halls, some swore they could still feel it, a presence, bitter and unfinished. A prince left behind, a ghost who never got his crown. He never wore the crown, he never had a trial, he never had a voice. Prince Eustace, heir to a war-torn throne, raised in fire, fed with fury, was swallowed by silence. No legacy, no revenge. Just a single banquet, a final breath, and a kingdom that exhaled without him. Some say it was mercy, others call it betrayal, but either way it worked. The war ended, and the crown passed to the very man he had been trained to destroy. But the story didn't start with Eustace. It began years earlier, with a woman who was promised the throne and a cousin who stole it. To uncover the brutal civil war that tore England apart long before Eustace's final feast, watch our episode on Matilda and the man who took her crown. And to see what kind of ruler rose from the ashes of this deadly succession, step into the next chapter. Henry II, the king who turned peace into empire and power into bloodline. This is Tortures of the Crown, where medieval history isn't just dates and names. It's betrayal, downfall, and death served cold. Subscribe for more stories of royal collapse, and we'll see you in the next episode. Your watch means more than you know.